So I can understand why we like comedy films or we like humorous novels, because we all like to laugh. And I can understand why we like an action film, because it makes us excited and gets the adrenaline going. But why would we want to be scared? Being scared is a horrible thing. It implies impending doom and danger. Why would we read horror books and why would we watch horror films?
You've just made an equivalency that may not be entirely true. You said horror is scary and that's bad. But is it? Being scared is one of the most important experiences of being human. In fact, being scared is basically how we learn almost everything in the world. It's how we learn not to stick our hand in the oven. It comes from being scared, and fictional scariness is sort of a testing ground for real scariness. If you can get through it in fiction, you're better armed to get through it in life. This is perhaps not that rational, because if I explained this to somebody and said, this is why I'm scaring you, they wouldn't believe me. But there's another explanation, I think, which is it's to do with roller coasters. You see, people queue up for hours to get on this thing, and it ratchets you up and up and up and up, and then suddenly you go, and it's the most terrifying thing. Do you like that?
Yes.
That's the problem. Why do you like it? Because at no point in this horrible rush towards death do you actually lose control. You actually know that you're going to be, well, in a few cases. Was it the famous roller coaster that somebody fell off recently?
They do occasionally come into the ground,
They
yes.
do occasionally. But on the whole, you know that you're safe. So it's like when you're a baby and your father lifts you up and throws you into the, well, that's probably a bad example, because suddenly I saw Michael Jackson dangling the baby over the balcony. but you see what I mean? He throws you up in the air, but you know he's going to catch you.
But I mean, it's interesting though, you mentioned roller coasters, but real roller coaster aficionados, their favorite roller coasters are the wooden ones, because they creak and sway, yes, and they feel more dangerous.
Yes, exactly. It's the feeling, not the actual speed. The steel ones, they're very, very fast, and certainly you get the sort of the zero-G moment is quite scary. But yeah, I agree with you that the wooden ones are the best.
But your argument that this is that being scared is a learning ground for life, of course, has to be true. But you could also argue in the same way that so is pain.
Afraid so, yeah. But
people don't tend to go out and hurt themselves in mild ways.
Well, there are those. But the thing is that, being scared and would be like having imaginary pain as opposed to real pain. So I think that on the whole, yeah, there's some substance to what you're saying, but I don't go out and have an actual vampire bite me just so that I'll learn not to have them bite me. It's all about the imagination. So again, I probably don't sign up for receiving 36 lashes or on the HMS Bounty just so that I know not to mutiny. But there's also another thing. You see, you mentioned comedy earlier. People love comedy, and I would like to propose that horror is essentially a kind of comedy. And that's about how you assemble a unit of horror and a unit of comedy. When the most basic comedy is a guy's walking down the street and slips on a banana peel. The banana peel, he didn't know it was there. And so it's all about building up to something and then having something there that you didn't expect. And then the comedy is what happens Now horror is exactly the same thing, except that he hits the pavement and his brains come out. I mean, that's the only difference. It's still the same. uh, and so when you as a director want something to be very scary, you have to use the same techniques as telling a joke for having a scary sequence, because you got to do the build up and the illusion that you're going this to, and then the taking away of the, and then it's just the payoff that's a bit different. That's all.
I mean, it's an interesting idea. The connection between comedy and horror. I always think the Marx Brothers. I can't remember which Marx brother it was who used to do that to somebody, which is, we all thought was hilarious. But the idea of actually somebody sticking both their fingers in your eyeballs is really not so pleasant. Until, of course, the other Marx brother learned to do that.
Well, then there's Home Alone. Why is that not a horror film?
Exactly. Yes. I think it's... I don't know whether a horror novel has ever won, the Booker Prize, or whether I certainly can't think of any horror film that's ever won an Oscar. Generally,
did Silence of the Lambs?
Silence of the Lambs did. Does
but
that count as
everybody
horror?
goes, "Oh my God, how unusual! A horror film." They don't.
Oh, but
go,
also, I bet the director would have said, "Oh, that isn't a horror film; it's a psychological thriller." That's what you do when you don't want to be...
how is that not horror?
But even so, you get my point.
Yeah,
that
very much
actually, horror is often considered almost second class.
Yes.
My question is, has it always been that way? Or is that a sort of more recent thing? And why do you think it is?
Well, I think one of the reasons we or people think of it as second class is perhaps the guilt associated with reading it. It is a guilty pleasure. I mean, because we read this book and there's these people being squished around and we are not sure we should really be enjoying it. And I mean, when Cinderella's sisters had their eyes pecked out by crows, an episode discreetly removed from the Disney version.
Yes.
or when they cut their feet to fit into the shoes, and then somebody noticed that there was blood coming from them. That's a glass slipper. It would be pretty obvious. But well, my thing is there's one element I think is the guilt or the squeamish. See, I mean, pornography isn't considered it's probably even on a lower level than horror, I would think, because it almost never has any literary pretensions whatsoever.
Or do you think it is that the more that we consider certain sort of baser instincts, and that it's felt that it's rather easier to make people scared than it is to move them to tears with the power of your drama, and therefore it's felt as sort of like what did they used to call the books? The penny dreadfuls.
Penny dreadfuls. Yeah.
The idea being that, yes, anybody can go boo, and that there's nothing particularly clever about that.
Well, I think there's an interesting point here is this. If the higher emotions, the nobler instincts are set on a pedestal, and sort of craven lusts are set at the bottom, violence is somewhere in between, isn't it? Violence is somewhere in between, and there's sort of a descent in people's minds, which is completely sort of silly, really, when you think about it, because I don't think people have sort of higher instincts without baser instincts. I think that it's a continuum, and I think that the more grounded we are on the earth, the easier it is for us to touch the sky, as it were. But I would say there's also, historically, you mentioned historically, it may not have always been the case that horror was this. When we do English Lit in school, we learn that one of the earliest real novels is The Castle of Otranto. And they call it a Gothic, but it's full of things that we today might consider to be horror, right? And then, Mary Shelley's novel. Is it a horror novel, or is it a warning about man not being meant to know things, or what is it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody today would think of Frankenstein as being horror, but maybe people at one time were more apt to see these higher intellectual sort of leanings hidden in horror. And I think it really happened. You see, it's we could blame it on Stephen King, if you like. I mean, he's so rich he won't mind. But here's the thing. In the 70s, horror was not yet its own genre in the bookshelves. There were books that were horror, but they were mixed in. Right? And then books like The Shining and Carrie became runaway bestsellers. And soon there had to be a new category of books that sort of were like Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happened with science fiction and fantasy, by the way, where Tolkien was never in its own series it was just a book. But then in the 1960s, when I think Ace Books in New York suddenly, and without a license, by the way, put out a huge mass market edition of The Lord of the Rings, when everybody in the whole, every sort of college student in the world bought this. And then suddenly there were all these other books, the Sword of Shannara, or Shannana as it is sometimes called, and there were hundreds of heroic fantasy and epic fantasy books, and there had to be another section. And every time there's another section like that, it's a ghetto. And every time there's a ghetto, people think it's a second-class form of literature.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
I lived through, of course, the 80s video nasties scare in UK, when a number of films like Driller Killer and who's it? Somebody I Spit on Your Grave got banned, and it made
Cannibal Ferox.
Cannibal Ferox, that was among them.
Cannot live with that. And of course,
And
Lucio Fulci.
Just about everything by Lucio Fulci. But this, of course, ignited the question that rears its head very often, which is, if films can change the world, as some people say, if it can change our opinions, if we come out of a film feeling elevated or excited, is it possible that films, or I would also include books, can they actually corrupt? Could they cause people to think in bad ways and do bad things?
It's a chicken and egg thing, I think, because you say can film corrupt, but it's also quite possible to say can corruption film, as it were. And the answer to that would be the more corrupt it is, the better material it is for the enthusiastic director or writer, right? There is, I think we all love to dig around in the garbage creatively. We don't want to admit it, but we do, right? I mean, because so many gems are found there. So actually, incredibly inspiring stories are found in the garbage all the time, right? Now, I would say, I think that corruption, I don't know exactly what you mean by corruption, but what do you exactly mean by corruption?
Could watching films which are bloody and where people stab each other incite one to go out and stab people?
Yes, well, of course, that's the moral majority argument for banning all those films. I can't remember her name, but there was this woman who was trying to get everything banned back
in England. It was Mary Whitehouse.
Mary Whitehouse, yes, right, and
But I mean, look, when these people confront filmmakers with
Yes.
this idea and say, you've made this horrible film in which you chop people's heads off. And they will always answer, it's the same argument as, guns don't kill people, people kill people, that they bear no responsibility. And surely, that is actually say that a job as a filmmaker or a writer is kind of worthless if we can't change people.
I think that the job of all art is actually to tell the truth about what we actually are as human beings, and in the sense that some truths are not very pleasant. It is our job. I'm not saying that Lucio Fulci is the great answer of the human condition. No, I'm not saying that. Of course, there's many sort of degrees of this, right? But you remember what Ovidio Assonitis said? That he said, my films may not be very good, but I've made them with real passion and love. And so I don't think we can. I don't think we can sort of call even a Lucio Fulci to the carpet about his intent to, or Ed Wood for the intent to do something that would actually illuminate the human condition. It's just a matter of.
But I'm going to argue with you about that because,
right.
That is a very convenient argument that creative people make to absolve themselves of the responsibility for their work.
I don't think they should absolve themselves. But what I don't think they should do is that if somebody kills somebody in a shopping mall, they shouldn't sue the author of a book for causing that to happen.
Certainly not if you're the author,
because there were a number of steps in between before that happened, such as the shooter happening to be a schizophrenic or something. It wasn't just, okay, I read this book, I kill you. That is the sort of simplistic reduction that we should avoid. It's got to be more complicated than that. But I don't think that we should be absolved of blame at all. I think that on some level it is our fault. I just don't think that we should be sued over it. That's all. I draw the line at that.
Have you ever, in your writing or even in your operas or your filmmaking, have you ever stopped yourself from doing something because you thought that's going too far? Or could you see yourself? In other words, do you have limits on something where you think, I think this would be too violent, too horrific, too disturbing to put in my work?
Well, if there is a limit, I don't think I've actually come across it yet, personally. But then, my horror of the 1980s and 90s was particularly extreme, some would say. I've noticed that your own work, on the other hand, can be quite tasteful, unlike mine. Unlike mine. You took out a lot of decapitation from my script. And it wasn't all about the fact that they were $2,000 a head either.
Oh, I don't. That was one reason.
But I think that everybody probably has a line somewhere, right? And it's a very personal thing.
Yeah.
One of the proudest moments of my life was when I was sitting on a panel discussing werewolves, and a woman in the audience got up and said, your description of this scene where a man was performing cunnilingus while turning into a werewolf, which was written entirely from the woman's point of view, was so convincing that it actually turned me on. Now, to me, that's like the highest compliment that I could be paid, because I had to write from the point of view of somebody who's completely not me in any possible way. I had to find that person somewhere and write from that person. Maybe
you've discovered a new genre, 50 Shades of Lycanthropy or something.
So some people might think a scene like that would be too extreme, and I certainly could not be filmed at the time, and maybe not even today. Or maybe it could. Could you film that scene?
Let's go and storyboard it.
Yeah, it's got to be done very, very tastefully.
So as somebody who has obviously written a great many novels, and quite a lot of them, I think we call them horror novels,
Yeah.
but also horror films, in a way they're very different. And of course this is a debate one can always have. Which is scarier? That which you read and conjure up in your own head, or that which you see? Are the monsters in our own heads better than the monsters we can make out of CG and latex?
Those CGs are getting better and better. I mean, we have to...
But regardless, could we ever film something that is as horrific as we have in our worst nightmares or our worst fears?
I would say that there's sort of... it's almost like the speed of light. There's a limitation that occurs, there's a hard barrier that occurs. And it's because of the technique of storytelling in film and the technique of storytelling in a novel. When you're writing a novel, you are entirely within somebody's brain, the viewpoint character, unless you're writing from as a sort of omnipotent third person, but that has not been fashionable for 150 years. People don't write like that anymore. But now we tend to write with a viewpoint character, which is almost like writing in the first person, except that it's in the third person. So we only see what that character sees, and the thing is, we can describe in very great detail what that person is feeling, and we can, if the reader identifies with the viewpoint character, then the reader feels the exact things that. Now, no matter how good a filmmaker you are, you can't create a film from inside somebody's mind.
Can't bypass the eyeballs.
A film is told in pictures, and by their very nature, there's somebody looking at the picture who is not in the picture. So one of the greatest compliments you can say about a film is that it's so sort of inclusive that you feel like you're in the movie.
Yes.
Right? But in a book, you're a good book, you're supposed to feel that way. Even in a second-rate novel, you're supposed to at least, the author's supposed to at least attempt to put you into the book. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what you're saying is that the experience of reading a book can be more powerful and more scary than a film. And I think I agree with you.
But it also could be I don't know every reader in the world, and many of them probably may not have the kind of imagination that could scare themselves. And maybe in that sense, it's great to have somebody do all the pictures for you.
But then that makes it just a sort of a lazy form of
lazy form of reading.
Well, like audiobooks.
Because audiobooks have the problem where they give you the voice that the character thinks in already. So you can't get that voice out of your head. Well, if you see a film adaptation of any great book, you also can't get the movie that you watched in your head when you read the book out of your head.
Yes, that's a big problem.
It's a big problem. I mean,
Stephen King, when somebody said to him, how do you feel about your books being ruined and being made into films? And he apparently pointed up at the bookshelf and said, I don't see them being ruined, they're still there, nothing's changed.
Yeah, he also very famously said you should just take the money and run.
Yes.
Although when it came to Maximum Overdrive, he decided not to run.
That's true. So you feel that, you've done both. Which is the more satisfying experience?
Oh, well, it's, writing a book is like pleasuring yourself, and working on a film is like an orgy. uh, I mean, film is all about.
It might be for the producer, it's not for a director. Now I know where the budget went.
No, I mean basically, and film has all these little bits and pieces, and everybody has to work together, or they have to hate each other, and yet somehow the dynamic makes it work, or
Yes.
whatever,
Yes.
It's definitely about several people creating something together. Whereas when you're writing a book, you're just in a room by yourself, and it's a very lonely occupation, really. I tell people who want to write that in the moment when you're sitting there and you type a sentence, you're the only person in the universe who's going to type that exact thing for that exact reason. You're basically as close as it comes to being God, because nobody else. You're the one thing that can create that 1 second of. So I'm not entirely sure that the movie making process is like that, because each of the artists, the actor, the director, they all have that one moment that they're creating, and then that one moment comes together and somehow has to coalesce.
Well, it's probably why they created the auteur theory, because directors didn't feel enough like God, so they had to create a theory to make them God.
And that theory, is, although it is the prevailing theory, it's quite flawed, as you know.
Yes.
Especially when we consider some of the great movies of the past, which may not have been directed at all in our modern sense. So, I don't know, we've strayed a little bit from the question, but it's about the written word versus the... Right. You've sometimes written a script that was made by someone else. Have you?
Yes. Yes.
And how did that feel?
Oh, very strange.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yes. But of course, a script is really just like the architecture's blueprint.
It's not a book.
It has no value in and of itself,
right?
Which I think is very, very different. But
and it's also a mistake that's often made by writers, that they think the script is the finished film.
Yes. When one looks back at some of the early horror films, they tend to look not at all scary, in fact often rather quaint and amusing. And I hate to say it, I often think, often people talk about The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe, which I don't understand. It's a lot of Edgar Allan Poe I don't think is scary anymore. I think we have become, horror has got more extreme, more explicit. I mean, Psycho was the first time that anybody had ever seen a toilet, and that in itself was shocking in the film. We have, to a certain extent, thrown out a lot of our inhibitions and limits, and doesn't that make it harder than ever to scare people? How do you push further? How do you scare people who are somehow anaesthetized now to things that would have terrified people 50 years ago?
Do you think that the pendulum will swing back? Or do you think that it has swung back from, say, the 80s?
No, I have no idea where we're going. But it often upsets me when I watch an old film that I remember as terrifying. I remember The Omen being terrifying, and showing it to somebody recently who couldn't understand why it was ever scary. Is that change, or is it just that now it would have been so much more explicit and so much... And I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I think that with The Omen, there's another element here. So the Omen, one of the Omen's, one of the reasons it works is that it's founded on belief. And belief has gone down the toilet.
It's lost its power because that which is referencing is no longer paramount, sort of thing.
Right, yeah. In my novel, Vampire Junction, Timmy Valentine explains that crosses and garlic don't work because people don't believe in them.
Right.
So why would they affect me?
Right.
And that could be an element. So because there's always one more taboo, though. I mean,
I'm not sure there are.
well, you'd be surprised. I mean, okay, Bram Stoker teased at the very limit of the sex taboo at the turn of the 20th century, right? And he did this by making the love object a dead person. I mean, basically, vampirism is about necrophilia in a very explicit way. It's about people, because it's about being kissed sexually by a corpse. And I think that people at the end of the Victorian era were still found sex to be very, very frightening. Sex itself to be frightening. I mean, they didn't learn about it from their parents or in school.
No sex, please, we're British.
Oh, well, yes, I'm sure you've said that many times when you but if I wrote a horror novel today that played on people's fear of sex, nobody would be frightened for a second.
Yes. What are the new? What is new? I mean, one remembers, of course, the films in the 50s, 60s, which were about nuclear threat.
Yes,
when
that was very
nuclear
frightening,
came
right.
around, and that became the new fear. Are we going to see a whole load of sort of COVID films? Is that
Well, we
we've got a
made one
new fear of
ourselves.
disease?
We made one ourselves.
Oh, that's true.
No, but also, what about environmental films? That's new.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Earth came back and took its revenge.
Yes.
That's a new thing because people see that it's really happening.
So maybe there are new avenues for horror that haven't yet been thought about, that there are new forms of fears that we aren't even aware that we are afraid of.
Well, when aliens finally come, that'll be a whole new genre too.
That's true. I'm often interested in the fact that a lot of different cultures that are not necessarily connected by a common source have similar monsters. There is in Thailand a Pidut Luat.
Yes.
There are many different cultures have the ideas of zombies, of something that sucks your blood, of a man that turns into an animal.
Yes.
Tell me about, also particularly from the point of view of your both Thai and Western influences, your idea of how horror is maybe not something that is invented, but maybe in fact is somehow inside ourselves and comes out in different cultures in similar ways.
Well, of course, Carl Jung would have a field day with that, and did. I would say that's probably the Pikachu is not something found in European culture much. This is the one that detaches itself from its body and crawls around, dragging itself by its guts, using its guts as sort of pseudopod, and lives entirely on shit. I mean, I haven't seen anything remotely like it in. But I would say that almost every other monster, from banshees to werebats, they do exist. I mean, the werewolf. Of course, the wild animal is different. In Thailand, it would be the Surasaming, so it would be the were tiger.
Were tiger, yes.
In Africa, it's the were leopard that we talk about. See, and as for Manak, which is the classic Thai story of the woman who died in childbirth and has her child and waits for her husband to come. Now, that's the same as La Llorona, for example. The Central American mythos of a woman wandering around the desert wailing about her child.
Yes.
And I think there's a Japanese film that has a very similar plot. Is it Ugetsu, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, something like that. So, if you want to say that the basic creatures of horror, the vampire, the werewolf, the zombie, if you want to say that those are all manifestations of the collective unconscious, I think I certainly wouldn't say no to that. But it's also hard to invent a completely new monster, isn't it?
Yes. One other thing, going back to the Thai, I always think there are two reasons to create monsters. One is if it's something that is innately scary to us as a very concept that strikes us to our core. The other reason I think we create monsters is obviously to scare children. And I think a lot of the Thai ghosts are sort of object lessons, aren't they? Get your washing in before nightfall, because if you leave it out, a hang might bleed on it. And don't be dirty, or otherwise you might become an aggressor. Aren't these often object lessons for the boogeyman we have in the West? Don't do that, or the boogeyman will get you.
Were you told about the boogeyman as a child?
Very similar. It wasn't the boogeyman, but there was a figure, yes, that I was taught about.
Of course, the Thai children of my age were told that Siui would get them.
Who was real?
Who was an actual person, but the real Siui was a much more sympathetic character. Although he did kill and eat a few people, but when you understand his life, he perfectly understandable almost. You know that he was actually found insane by the court and ordered to psychiatric counseling, and then Field Marshal Sarit thought it wouldn't work, so he said, "Okay, just execute him anyway." So,
the other thing recently,
should have studied
up
him.
Until recently, you could go and look at him sort of pickled, couldn't you?
I had my picture taken with him.
And unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever, they recently decided that was not entirely appropriate, and so they took him out of his jar and cremated him.
I dearly wish that they had at least made a wax copy before, and that's left it there. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. For so many years, that hospital and taking children to see and be scared by it. I mean, the poor man. Okay, of course.
Have you thought that perhaps when you eventually many years pass away, perhaps you could volunteer to be put in a jar in the museum to replace him?
I'd be glad to. I mean, I don't see. The thing about Siui was not really a jar. It was sort of like a telephone booth. It was a very, very peculiar thing. And there was another serial killer in the same room, was a lesser known one. Sort of, yeah, it was as if he had to have his sort of he had to have a sort of his minions or the lesser serial killer sort of flocking behind him, like so.
Well, the other thing, going back to the same idea, I've been to what I think they call in Thailand the hell parks.
Oh yeah, those are great, aren't they?
Where, again, I suppose they're to scare the hell out of children to not misbehave, but they're these rather lurid and grotesque statues of people sort of picking out your liver and your entrails being dragged out. And
yeah. By the way, we've got to shoot at one of those. But I think that this is not that dissimilar from, and I don't think they're just for children, actually, by the way, but I think it's not that different from priests in the 12th century. Their description of what things that happened in hell was not that different from us. But the Thais have such a powerful visual sort of sense that actually building parks and amusement parks, essentially. I wonder if Dante's Inferno could have a similar treatment one day. Could have an Inferno land.
Absolutely.
we could travel down to the Ninth Circle, meeting various famous killers and popes and whatever as we go down. Could be a lot of fun. Maybe somebody watching this show is already stealing my idea.
Very often when we think of the classic days of horror films, the drive-in movies, the Roger Corman films, these were really intended largely for a teenage audience. When we think of the old horror comics, the EC comics, those were exclusively, I think, probably read by either teenagers or strange adults. And I think for a lot of people, as we get older, we gradually move away from horror films and horror fiction. Do you think that that is as a result of, as we get older, we have seen true horrors and we've seen real monsters, and that the monsters are no longer need to be boogeymen. They are the sort of the cancers and the depression and the things that plague us. Do you think that we grow? The question is, do we grow out of horror?
Yes, I think the more you haven't actually taken that journey all the way, because the cancers but then there's a realization that the horror is actually us.
Explain.
Because every dark thing that has ever existed in literature or in film came out of somebody's head. Right?
Yes.
And therefore, you see, I believe that we gradually come to realize that we have to accept our own darkness and come to terms with it. And this is part of the journey of life. So, in the 80s, I was in my 30s, and I watched every single horror film the minute it came out, without exception, no matter how bad. If it was straight to video, I immediately bought the video or rented the video. I haven't been going to see a lot of horror movies in the last 2 years. You couldn't see any movies at all. But now when I go and see movies, I don't choose the horror film right away. One reason may be that I haven't seen that many changes in the structure of a horror film, and it's become just a sort of a catalogue of plot points that you know all of them. You know all of them in advance. I don't know what have you seen a horror film where you couldn't predict what was going to happen next?
It's
lately,
rare.
Not lately though.
I mean, I think that's why back, when was it? About 20 years ago, the horror world started to look increasingly to Asia. We got those films, The Ring and The Grudge, because
they were slightly different. They had something else.
They reinvented it, and then after a while, they got remade, and we got used to that, and so then it had to move again.
And now it falls to us to reinvent it, right? So
I wanted to go back. One of the things that you said earlier, and I think we've talked about this before, but I've been to different film festivals.
Yes.
Both of the sort of conventional or art house type film variety, and of the horror film variety. And so, and it's very interesting when you go and watch a horror film and you see sometimes the most horrible, cannibalistic, vile, gory, depraved things on the screen. You come out and you meet the director, and for a second you don't quite know what to say to the person who created this horror show.
They're always really nice, though.
And that is the strange part. I almost have a rule that the more disgusting and horrible the film, the nicer the filmmaker. And so...
There's a reason for that. Do you know what it is?
Go ahead.
Writing horror and making horror films is a great way to flush all that garbage out of our psyches. And therefore, there isn't anything left. And we are always nice because everything, we've sort of worked through all that stuff, all these traumas and sort of horrifying things and our secret desire to want to stab women or whatever. I mean, it's all gone because we've externalized it rather than internalizing. We've vicariously sort of lived it through our work. And I think that's why, I mean, you're a very nice person, but your films are all about hideous serial killers who pay women to be allowed to kill them, and or strange feral children running in forests or whatever, or you know, sleazy bar girls. They're not about the sort of most elevating aspects of the human condition, and yet you're a wonderfully nice person.
Well, I don't know. Do you ever think so? If one can see this in a way as a form of therapy,
Yeah.
will you ever reach a point when you're okay and you have no need of it anymore? Then will you suddenly write the great romance or the?
But I've written a few of those romances, so I must be getting that way.
Okay.
And I haven't written a horror novel except when working with you. You know, I haven't touched horror in quite a while, and actually I'm getting a lot of complaints from readers about this. Why isn't there another sequel to Vampire Junction?
And you simply respond, "I'm cured."